Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Have You Considered? Today I talk with Diana Iannarone, who's a life invention coach and author of the book Me and My Shadow Move from Fear and Control to Love and Freedom. Diana's been a huge fixture within my life and my family's life, helping us through some pretty difficult times. And I hope that a lot of what we talk about today can help some people in some form or another. We talk largely about toxic relationships, toxic people, while also getting into non toxic relationships and how we can better communicate and learn to love and grow with each other. So, without further ado, here's Diana. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Have You Considered? Today I'm talking with a friend, I would say at this point, life reinvention coach, Diana Iannarone. We've met because she was actually helped me through some tough times in my life, and I couldn't be more grateful. She's helped my family out tremendously. And I just want to start off by just getting a little bit of background information on who you are, how you got to this point.
Thank you, Isaac. Loved your intro. Well, it's kind of an arduous journey, as I think it is for most people that tend to help people. It's sort of, you kind of been there, done that, and didn't do it all well. So you learn a lot through that process. My background was actually in finance, and I think it's important to mention my reason is because, like many people, we're going through life trying to get the validation, so that we can feel good about ourselves. And in my case, I always wanted the validation of my dad, and he was in banking. So lo and behold, I went into finance, and um, I sort of had this propensity to have stamina and endurance. No matter what I did, I would really try and work overtime to do it well. Again, seeking that uh, elusive validation. But it worked out favorably in business because I just worked my butt off, and I started at the bottom of a company, worked my way up, became a leader, learned that I loved helping people reach their goals. So it was all preparation, I think, for where I was going. And I guess it was around 2005, actually 2001, I started to realize that I wanted to get out of corporate America. And, what do I want to be doing instead? And it took me a few years because I so identified with my work being what I do. That was what I was as far as I could figure at that time. How do you separate yourself from who you are when you think it's what you do? So it took me a few years of doing some self evaluation. And finally, in 2005, I left my quote unquote big career job and started my coaching business, which led to huge awakenings about what I wasn't paying attention to while I was busy trying to work really hard. And that's kind of where the wake up call came about my own personal world that kind of was maybe ignored. I call it being asleep. We're focused on one thing while the world's falling apart behind us. And so, kind of that process of learning how to develop people and have sort of an external focus and really trying to get the validation of my dad led to the transition of my career to realize it didn't matter to get the validation from the external world. And what mattered was paying attention to our own world. And that's what led me to help other people do the same thing, focus on where they might be asleep.
Right. And your I guess slogan would be "Wake up, stand up, live free." And I know me and my family have all read your book, "Me and My Shadow: Move from Fear and Control to Love and Freedom," and I highly recommend it to everyone as well. One thing that I got from the bio that I think could be applicable and really helpful to our conversation. It is our decision to remain asleep, unconscious to the abuse we allow in our lives, that keeps us fragmented and wounded. It is time to awaken to all the pieces of ourselves and unite them in wholeness to rediscover that omnipotent power within us and remember how to ignite that power to create an entire world at peace. Do you want to go into a little bit about what you mean by that?
Gee, I haven't read that in a long time. I so agree with it. Wow, yeah, I like that. It really is. I mean, in my own, I like to personalize it. You and I talked a little bit about this because I think people, when they can relate it to themselves, then they can do something with it. And for me, the way that I came to that awakening is I totally was ignoring the ways that I allowed myself to be diminished and abused and So, like, on one hand, I look to the outer world like somebody who really had their shit together. Got a big job, I've got a big position, I've got lots of people that respect me, and blah blah blah. But behind closed doors, my life was a mess. I was in terribly abusive, I'm going to say, relationships, because it wasn't just a singular one, it was my pattern of behavior. And interestingly, that stamina and endurance that I referenced earlier, that really helped me in my career to push and push and push. I was using that same application in my personal world. Like, it's not working, but I can fix it. It's not working, but I can try harder. And so the asleep part is when we're not recognizing what's actually happening to us. We're so busy with an external focus that we're like, how can I make this right? How can I make this better? And not saying, but what's happening to me while I'm doing it. And so the asleep part is where you're ignoring it. The wake up part is where suddenly you say, oh wow, this really hurts. And I think most of us, our first reaction is, well, these people are being mean to me, so it's them. But the truth is, the bigger question is, why is it we are tolerating this intolerable situation? Why are we tolerating this, I'll call it, abuse? And the answer is simple. It's the sense of who we are, just for who we are and not for what we do. So I guess the best way to describe it would be, we have a doing side, and that was like what your work is. You go out there, you work really hard. But the kind of all too often ignored other side is the being side, the side of us that just is. What are we worth if we're not doing something? And I think people like me that get involved in relationships at an intimate level that are very diminishing and abusive have a characteristic that surprise most people. They have high self-confidence, but low self-esteem. And the high self-confidence is what makes them an incredible doer, right? They can get things done. They have the stamina, they have the endurance. But because they have low self-esteem, they don't see their worth. So rather than recognizing a situation and saying, this is harmful, this is bad for me, I don't deserve this, instead they have, I can fix it, I can fix everything, I can do it. So relative to what you read, it's sort of, once you realize that it's not just about your doing, it's also about your being. You elevate yourself and you see the world through completely different eyes, awake eyes. And once you are awake, you can connect with your own intuition, with your own wisdom, and you get what I call an internal locus of control. So most of us have an external locus of control, which means we are driven by outer circumstances, we are driven by outer opinions, we are driven by our perceptions of what people think of us. Once we wake up and then learn to stand up and build boundaries differently and no longer tolerate the intolerable, we start to get an internal locus of control, which empowers us to make decisions that are for the highest good, but also for our highest good. Like, we factor ourselves into the formula. And so I believe that when we do that in our small world, we're then able to do it in the bigger world as well.
Right. So, how does that kind of relate? Because something which you talk a lot about is attachment styles and especially upbringing with especially mother relationships. Now, you mentioned your father and your own
Yeah.
experience. How would you kind of distinguish the two kind of things to look for and take into consideration when thinking about that?
Thank you. Great question. Well, first of all, 100% of the time, whatever we're going through, it is an absolute given. It reverts back to childhood always. I mean, I'll have people even come to me, for business coaching, and they'll always not want to talk about their childhood. And I'm like, well, we can't get there without it. It's just always stems to that. So here's, Diana's belief, okay, and it proves itself time and time again. So I'm pretty convicted in it. The father side often has to do with how we'll do in business. And do remember, when I say father, it doesn't mean you had to get it from your father. It's just that masculine energy, whatever parent, does that. So the father side is about building self-confidence, telling you you're a good doer, building you up. And the more that you believe that, the more successful you'll be in business. The mother's role is completely different. The mother's role is supposed to be the nurturer. And the nurturer would look like if you fell off your bike, your father might say something like, "Get up, you could do it, just go back on your bike." What in a perfect world would happen is your mother would say, "Oh my gosh, that must be hurting." And if you were crying, she might say, "Anybody would be crying if that happened to them." But a lot of us don't get that nurturing. We don't get that validation for our feelings. So we start to question if our reactions to things, the way we feel, is valid. So if someone's always telling me, "Oh, it doesn't hurt, oh, just suck it up, oh, just keep going," we start to think, "Oh, this felt like pain to me, but maybe it's not." And so we become what I call our adapted self, because we all want love, we all want acceptance. And if we're not getting it when we show these kinds of behaviors, or I'll say emotions, we just start hiding those. And as we keep hiding them, we become really numb. And as I said, we become this adapted self, and we lose the ability to just be real because we're afraid of not having acceptance. I describe it as there's three U's, YOU. The you are afraid you are, the you want people to believe you are, and the you really are. And ideally, we all need to come into and accept the you we really are. So I believe all of our false or limiting beliefs that stifle our entire life presence came from childhood, and most of them before the age of 7. And as from the father side is the limitations on our confidence, and from the mother side is on our sense of worth just as a being, like our worthiness of love, our worthiness of having our emotions accepted.
Right. And for someone who may not be able to go back into their past as easily, like I'm sure a therapist, of course, helps with that. I have the utmost belief in that, as I am an example of it.
Mhm.
But very often, if people haven't taken that look back into their past and really examined their relationship with their family at a young age, it's hard for them to really figure out what exactly is, I don't want to say wrong with them, but what they believe is wrong with them.
Yes.
And that's something which I think a lot of people need to or should uh, try to bring into question a little bit more. But what's a good place to start?
Well, that is another great question, and I mean that genuinely, because first of all, a lot of people, when I say, okay, well, let's kind of, because sometimes we could just go to their memories, like, hey, just tell me a memory that sticks with you from childhood, and the person will tell me, and from that one memory, I can sometimes create a long, accurate list of beliefs that they might have without even knowing them beyond that first call. And often they're sort of stunned, like, wow, yes, I those are my beliefs. And suddenly they could see the connection from that memory to the beliefs that are playing out in their present day. But to further exemplify what you said, some people say, well, I don't really remember my childhood. I don't really remember anything. And the amazing part of the truth of how this works is there's always a thread from the present day to the childhood. So if the person can't remember the childhood, their present day experiences are going to be what you can look at. And you could back up and say, if you look at all of this, there seems to be a theme, and the theme is this. And even if they can't remember their childhood, they can suddenly see how the same patterns, it's really about patterns, the same pattern of behavior happens over and over and over again. And once you can see the pattern, once you can see how it's impacting you, even if you can't remember the specific way you got to that place, you can suddenly have this awareness that you never had before. And now that you're aware, all of a sudden in each circumstance, you go, oh, there it is again. Oh, there it is again. And you start to say, okay, so I have this belief. Maybe I don't even know where I got it, but I have this belief. It keeps replaying. It's limiting my life. It's hindering my life. So now you have to become more conscious and start taking that unconscious pattern behaviors that you've had with you probably since you was 7, which just keeps getting more and more painful as you keep doing it, because big people have bigger problems, little people have little problems. And it keeps getting bigger, but now that you're conscious of it, you can go, so in this instance, consciously, I'm going to make a different decision. And it's kind of unnerving when you go to make a different decision, because it's outside of your scope of comfort, because it's not the way you've ever played life before. And that's why it takes courage, to that stand up part, wake up, stand up. That stand up part takes courage. I mean, when you are going to change your behavior or just even a response to somebody or put up a boundary where you're used to being a doormat, you get scared. But when you start to see that, hey, but this is working, this is like changing things, then you get more and more courage. And then you keep moving closer and closer to that living free.
Yeah, and I think it would probably be very important for our listeners to kind of hear just a little bit of your story and a circumstance of how you learned that about yourself, and have gotten you to the point now where you can help other people realize it, because you were in very tough situations in your life, as evidenced by passages of the book, obviously.
Yeah.
So maybe just a little bit of insight into what you kind of struggled with, and what was the final thing where you're just like, okay, you know what, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to start to reevaluate myself in a different way and take more respect and love for myself.
Thank you. Well, it's kind of interesting. It's hard to do it succinctly, but I'm going to do my best here. When I was a young person, I always thought I was going to write a book. And it's not because I thought I was a great writer. I just thought there was like something I was supposed to say. And in my heart of hearts, are you ready? This is what I thought. I thought that I was supposed to teach the world how to heal the heart of the abuser. Hello. So just, talk about patterns. So if you think that that's what your role is, a little common sense would say, well, then you have to find yourself in those positions to prove that that could be done. And so I would kind of find these people that sort of didn't seem to understand their self worth. Well, let me change that. My perception was they didn't seem to understand their self worth. So I would try and build them up. I would try and help them see their value, not realizing these were not genuinely situations where people didn't see their self worth. What instead they were was people who realized I had the stamina and endurance to give myself completely to their healing. And so the circumstances were not what, in my asleep viewpoint, what they were. It was something very different and calculated and manipulative, which I clearly didn't have the vision to even see that. And I always want to quantify that anyone who hasn't lived in a type of relationship with an abusive person, a sociopath or a narcissist, it's almost completely unrelatable to them that anyone would tolerate what we tolerate. But it's the part of us that's asleep can't see our suffering. We can only see their suffering. So in my life, multiple times, I would give myself financially, I would give myself emotionally, I would allow myself to be very controlled. I mean, when I look back on it, it's hard to even imagine it was me. But I felt, well, if they're that insecure and they need like all these touch points and they need all this so they know that I really care, I'm going to give all that to them, but not realizing just the abusive manner that I was being treated in, which, oh boy, it's quite extensive. Lots of control and power. If anybody's ever looked at a power and control wheel on, which is the standard for domestic violence, if you just Google it, you'll find it. The abuse, most people think of it as like people punching you in the face. And although that is abuse, the power and control wheel is like a testimony to the life I lived and a lot of other people have lived, where it's more subtle than that. It's on the outer edges. And so you make excuses. But the maybe most important thing to say is most of us we have conscience. We have a conscience about what we do. But these individuals don't. So when we experience the behavior, we can't believe that somebody would actually do that. So we feel like we must be missing something. We feel like, I must be misunderstanding this because nobody would just be that mean. Um, so I feel like I'm maybe not doing a very articulate job explaining this, but what I'm basically trying to say is when you think that they're just hurting, you become over sympathetic, over empathetic, and you're trying so hard to heal them when instead you should be looking at also what's happening to me and the level of control and obviously my book is that story. So, it took me a lot of pages to articulate.
Absolutely. No,
It's a pretty long book.
I think you did a great job at answering that. And I know you mentioned that because you have, it's actually the way that I found you was through your YouTube channel where you talk a lot about personality disorders, specifically
Mhm.
narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. And I
Yes,
would maybe just a brief description so people can kind of understand those terms because they're thrown around all the time, right? Like, oh,
they
this
are.
person's narcissistic. But what does that actually mean?
Well, first of all, with just the concept of somebody's narcissistic, it's kind of like everybody is a little bit. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, who doesn't like to be told they're great or, whatever. So you have to understand there's like a spectrum of this. And I always have to give my disclaimer I am not a medical professional. But not only have I lived with this personally for many, many years, um, my big wake up came in actually 2008. I left my big job, if you will, in 2005. 2006, I'm like, something's not right. 2007, I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? And then 2007 and 2008 is when I first woke up to even the existence of this kind of thing. I mean, we all know it in a textbook, right? I mean, who hasn't heard about a sociopath or a narcissist or, Freddy Krueger, though? This is what we picture. Like we picture, somebody with a, machete or, somebody that just, you look at them and you can tell. And so I was totally deceived into not understanding that these are like everyday people. They walk amongst us, they seem normal, even sometimes likable. And so I didn't have the awareness that there could be people walking without a conscience. And I have a little different viewpoint of narcissism and sociopathy, meaning I don't use them interchangeably, although there's overlap. And as you mentioned on YouTube, I have one specific video that gets a lot of attention because of my differentiation. And I'll go ahead and maybe use the example I use in the video because it might be the simplest way. In my personal belief, the sociopath, let's say you're swimming with him, he's in the water going, or she, just want to clarify, can be a man. I happen to be a woman, so, my experience was mostly with men. But, he's in the water thinking, how can I control this woman? How can I make her do something? Well, I know that she's sensitive to my needs. I know that she's going to be responsive to my needs. So I'm going to act as if, I have a cramp or I have a pain or I have some sort of suffering. And of course, us, the self-confident doers, is going to be like, I can come and save you, So we're going to come running over and try and save him. And then we're actually gonna probably succeed. We're gonna get him out of the water, and they're gonna start with a little bit of gratitude, but then they're gonna be like, well, what took you so long? Why didn't you do it this way? And it's like, wow, I didn't win. I think I might have saved his life, but yeah, I still somehow I'm still the bad guy here. So to me, a sociopath is very intentional about wanting to control you, and that wanting to control you. That's the best way. A
Mhm.
narcissist just thinks of himself. There's just no room for you. He doesn't even like what. So if I'm in the water with a narcissist, he's not thinking I want to push her under. He's thinking, wow, I've got a cramp. I got to get out of here. Oh, look, here's this thing, this object, and the object, of course, is you. But he's gonna just climb all over you, walk out, and you're gonna be like, look, wait, didn't you notice you almost drowned me? I was just getting out of the water. Like, what's your problem? So it's to me, they're very different. But either way, you're the object that they have no genuine love for, except for what fulfills them in it. And so that was hard to understand. It was hard to understand that anybody could be that thoughtless, that anybody could not consider and value you as a person, that you're nothing more than just an object they can either control or leverage or use for their own whatever, fill that in, for their own success, for their own fulfillment by feeling like they matter or they're important. I mean, it is, once you know it, though, I have to tell you, like, people always say to me things like, well, how'd you know he was going to do that? And I'm like, it is so predictable. It can almost be boring once you really get it. Because there's not a lot of question. It's going to be this or that. And it's because the patterning, we are all pattern individuals. And once you see the pattern, it becomes highly predictable. And that's why I'm able to get a lot of people out of these relationships, because I could see the pattern and the intuitive nature of what they'll do next, mainly because they care very much, especially in the case of a narcissist, about their reputation. It's just so to me. And you mentioned psychopath. I mean, to me, a psychopath, that's like really on the far end of the spectrum. And of course,
Right.
I often worry because these people that we're talking about can be extremely violent. I have experienced violence at their hands. I know many people who have. And, we all know about the gazillion cases in the world where someone says, he's abusing me, and people on the outside are going, oh no, he's charming. He's so nice. He's so this, and then sometimes people end up dead. It's just, it is such it hides behind the shadows. That's why the name of my book is Me and My Shadow. It's back here.
Yeah. And the thing that in our first phone call actually together, because I was just getting out of a pretty toxic relationship, and the hardest thing for me to understand, I think a lot of people who have empathy and are perhaps have aspects of codependency, which we can get into a little bit after. The hardest part is to, one, kind of accept that that person doesn't love you or has never loved you or just doesn't have the capability to. And the other main thing is you try and put yourself in someone's shoes very often. That's what empathy is, right?
Yeah.
So if you cannot see yourself doing the things that this person is doing to you, or maybe to someone that you love or someone around you, it makes it very hard to come to closure or understanding, because you can't accept that this person would even have the gall or the ability to do the things that they're doing.
So well stated. I honestly, obviously, you can't see me because we're on audio, but I'm like shaking my head. Yes, 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 exactly. And that's what I meant earlier about, because we have a conscience and somebody's doing something that's so incredibly cruel, you're trying to rationalize it in your mind because they couldn't just be doing that. There must be something I don't understand. And, I recall in my conversation with you and, hundreds and hundreds of other people, they'll want to understand it. I want to understand, why are they doing this to me? And I'm like, well, because you signed up. Okay, because there's a lot of people they can't do this to because that person understands their worth from a self-esteem perspective and wouldn't tolerate the intolerable. But us who are very empathic feel for them, as almost a priority. And so we're trying to give them more compassion so that what we see as their insecurities that is attacking us, if we could just heal that, we think then we'll get what we always dreamed of. And, it's just never going to happen. So lots of times people will call me and they'll say, oh, but I love him or her. I love him so much. And I'm like, okay, tell me how he helps you feel loved. And, it's often a hard question for people to answer. And so often it's their perception of love is a little distorted. And to help them first understand, love and its real meaning of honor and, respect and listening, and, we could go on. Those components are generally not in these kinds of relationships. And what you said was something like, we can't comprehend anybody doing this to somebody they love. And we also can't comprehend that they don't have the capacity for love. I have to say that that's the biggest piece when somebody recognizes that it's not within this individual's capacity. That's when they can start moving forward and become, like I said, that internal focus instead of that external. They want to know how they can fix them. They want to understand them. It's all about them, 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 them. I mean, any book I ever read was so that I could help them. I never read it to try and help me. That was like the hello, teachers teach what they most need to learn. I'm out there teaching it, didn't even realize what a mess my own life was,
Mhm.
So you're right in that we can't see it and we can't comprehend it because we have a conscience, we have empathy, and it's hard to imagine that somebody else simply doesn't. And once you don't, then you can get a new perspective.
And what's one thing that I guess people who are going through this, because I know personally a lot of people who have struggled with the fact that a support system after situations like this, because they've never experienced it, it's very hard for them to give the support that that person needs, because there's always a little bit of that, oh well, did you consider this, or you can like you can fix them, like there's all these aspects. Whereas when you go to someone like you, or you talk to someone like you, it's very black and white in the sense of this person is doing harm to you and you need to start taking care of yourself first. But with a lot of people, they don't have a voice that says that, and their support systems are a little bit scattered because they can't really understand what that person has gone through or is going through.
Great question, and there's actually two sides to that that I want to emphasize, because it's one is how are you there for that person, but the other is prior to the real wake up of that person, usually their partner. And I'm referring to this as if it's only in intimate relationships. It's not. It can happen in the workplace. It can happen in friendships. I mean, this is just the dynamic of the relationship. But a lot of the work I do is around intimate relationships. But these individuals isolate you. That's what they want to do. They want to isolate you. So they want to make it so that you leave your job or leave your friends. They start to make you question these people, or maybe these people are mistreating you, and you start to doubt. They want to create doubt in your mind about the people you think that love you, the people you think that care for you, about your own capabilities. I mean, they try and make you not have confidence in your thoughts, in your feelings. You start to question everything. So very often what happens when somebody wakes up, they are often completely alone. So they don't, how do they go to anybody? And even when you do go to somebody, your stories are so surreal that people are like, yeah, like that can't really be what happened. So there's two parts of this. The first part is we need to recognize before it happens that we're being isolated. This is part of the wake up. I love when I can get them still while they're in the relationship, I can show them, because it's so, again, predictable. So the isolation, if that's already happened, now we've got two problems. Okay. The person wakes up, realizes they need to get out, and they have no one. So when I do get phone calls from people that say, oh, my friend, my sister, my whomever is in this relationship and I want to help, but they don't realize what's happening. There's little you can do in that situation. You can't wake somebody up until they're ready to be woken. So it's very frustrating when in those instances you can see it, and if you tell them, they won't believe you. There's nothing you could do. But I do tell that person, stay connected to them. Stay connected to them. Don't run from them, because when they do get the rest of the story and they feel it, they're going to need somebody. So I try and help the family or friends not allow the isolation to be successful.
Right. And I know we've talked a little bit about personality disorders, mostly the negative ones. And I know you alluded to this a little bit prior, but what are some of the aspects, whether it be that people can kind of look for in their childhood or analyze about themselves, which can make them, I know codependent is something I've already mentioned, and it's something that is pretty prevalent, I find. Can you go into a little bit of how we can evaluate why we may have these over empathetic and over nurturing beliefs, and how we can use them as a benefit and a positive, but also minimize the negativity?
Well, I believe that the absolute crux of the dynamic of people that like me, that there is, a whole bunch of us out there, is that number one, our feelings were not validated as a child. If we were crying, it was like, I'll give you something to cry about. We were not nurtured for our feelings. It was not investigated into what we were feeling. We were not heard when we wanted to explain what happened or what. So through that process, our self-esteem gets completely invalidated, and we just simply don't see our worth, and we think our feelings are unimportant, and we have no right to do that. Okay, to have those feelings. But the second part of it, and I think this is the big piece that I think gets missed a lot, is the second part is that we were kind of the fixer in the family dynamics. We're the one that like holds it all together, So that's our confidence at work, right? Do, be the bigger person. Let's mend this. Let's fix this. We can make it all right. We can. And so those two components of not having our own feelings validated or, accepted or even allowed to be experienced, made us very aware of other people's feelings. Okay, so very aware of, oh, that person must be feeling harmful, harmed. That person must be feeling this. So we can see it for others, but not for ourselves, where we have an other focus. And we believe we can make them feel better. So we go out in the world now with this understanding, okay, that we can feel the feelings of others, and we believe, because we're not thinking properly or feeling properly, that we can fix it. Okay, so we keep enduring because we have the confidence and because we were assigned often that responsibility as a child to make everything all right again. And so, to me, the thing is to go into your childhood and ask yourself, did I feel validated for my feelings? Did I get, hugs and kisses when I was hurting? Was I given compassion when I was feeling those things? And if the answer is no, you're probably a target. A target has high self-confidence, low self-esteem. Period. The end. I have no doubt about this. I'm completely convicted in it. Because if you think of it as a chess game, you're playing an intimate love relationship. The other person's playing a chess game. They want to win the chess game. It's not about love at all. Love doesn't even exist. And the most powerful player on the game of chess is the queen. Again, this could be a man, but just for the sake of roles, the queen can move any direction. So she's the powerful one on the board. And, face it, she protects the king. That's what she's supposed to do. And so the ability to protect and make everything all right is what gets leveraged in these relationships. And we have to look at, wait a minute, am I getting love here, or am I just being the protector? I mean, so often we lie about the harm we're experiencing with these relationships because we're afraid they'll get in trouble or have consequences. They operate with complete impunity because we protect them. And part of that was our upbringing. Don't get dad mad. Don't, just make nice, just apologize to your sibling. It was always about finding a way that everything would be all right. And all you had to do was sacrifice yourself, your feelings, and any expression of what you were feeling.
And I know you mentioned a few times, and this is something that I've struggled with a lot in the past, once again, to my upbringing largely.
Yes.
In terms of one, feeling emotion, being able to express emotion, and then also being able to rationalize emotion. Now, these are three aspects which I think a lot of people struggle with in some form or another. And it's a huge barrier, I think, especially within relationships, even healthy relationships, in terms of like a male to female dynamic, or it doesn't have to be male to female dynamic, but largely people talk in different languages, not necessarily love languages, but in terms of emotion versus rational kind of thought. What are some of the tips? Because I know you've dealt with healthy couples as well. You do some couple
Yes.
counseling.
Yes.
What are some tips that you have in the case of that for people to better communicate their needs via emotions while also not getting frustrated if those emotions are irrational?
Wow. Okay. Okay. So let's start with the beginning. Most people are afraid to communicate their emotions. So that's the first problem we have. Why did that happen? It happened because of what I just described. When they tried to communicate their emotions, the emotions weren't accepted. We were told we were wrong. You're crying when you fell off your bike, stop being a baby. Well, if you just got hurt and you're bleeding, hey, you're crying. Like, okay, that's kind of what you're supposed to be doing. But so very early on, like I said, before the age of 7, we shut down a lot of those valves that enabled us to express our emotions, because when we expressed our emotions, they were received negatively. Unexamined, we keep that for a long, 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 long time. Okay. And it's not just we're not used to expressing our emotions. Whomever we're expressing it to is also probably not used to expressing their emotions. So then what you have is a lot of people repressing their emotions and repressing their emotions and repressing their emotions, and then resenting the people around them, which resentment is a byproduct of you not doing what you needed to do, and just the other person gets the blame. Because even if that person's going to react, I need to learn to still express my emotions. But we've become so numb to our emotions, we can't even do it. I think that was part of what you were trying to say. Like, we don't even know how. And so,
Mm-hmm.
the first step in the work that I do often is telling people all I want you to do first is start to recognize your emotions, which means throughout the day, I want you to say, I feel, and fill in the blank. I feel sad. I feel happy. I feel numb. I feel stressed. I feel this. Because for the first time, you're going, okay, I'm going to honor my feelings. I'm just going to acknowledge what they are. But also to the point of the question you just brought up, after we acknowledge it, so I'm angry, let's just say, then we go, well, that's stupid. I shouldn't be angry. So then we invalidate it. Okay. And I suggest to people the emotion that shows up is the right one. And what I mean by that is it just is. Okay. You feel anger. The basis of that anger isn't right or wrong. What will be right or wrong is what you do with that anger. Okay. So the first step in any relationship dynamic, and thank you for clarifying that I do help couples also get better relationships. I always tell people I'm not the Terminator. I don't, it doesn't go with that. Okay. But it's about getting relationships to a healthy game. And, before we finish, not that it's a game, but, maybe I'll recall to say the tennis match, and that's kind of what it's all about. But so the first thing is to recognize our emotions. So how do you do that? You become conscious. So instead of reacting and behaving on all these different ways or volatile or whatever, we say, okay, I'm feeling something. What is this? And we sit with it and we try and give it a name. If we can't give it a name, then we accept I can't give it a name. But so the first step in having whole and complete relationships and your own self being whole and complete is just begin to honor your own feelings. Okay, so now you recognize you feel that. Rather than go to judgment, try and understand what is making you feel that. So what is the reason I'm feeling angry? Okay, and maybe it's something somebody said that hurt you. And obviously this is very complex because you being hurt by what somebody said could be because they said something hurtful, or it could be because you have a wound in that place. And therefore, their well-intended communication can come in as hurtful. So there's a lot of moving parts, a little too complex to explain simply. But the first thing is to recognize what's generating the anger. Once you know what it is, if you know it's your own wounds, my advice is grab your journal and start to work on it. Like maybe somebody said something that you perceived was something about your weight, and maybe you're very self-conscious about your weight. Well, if someone said, man, you look fat, well, that makes them not so nice. I mean, we can agree to that. Yet, if somebody called you fat and you're very comfortable in your weight, you'd be like, I don't know what's going on with them, but like you wouldn't own it. But when we own it, it's because it's a wound. So then we need to self-reflect. But if it's somebody just being cruel, then we need to put up a boundary. Okay. And that boundary might be, it's not okay to say that to me. I always tell people you're going to become the one-liner god or goddess because you're not going to explain and justify and exhaust yourself anymore. You're just going to put up a boundary. It's not okay to talk to me like that. It's not okay to speak to me that way. It's not okay to treat me that way. So first part is to recognize our emotions. Second part is to try and assess what the root of those emotions are. And is this our wound or is this person's behavior not acceptable? If the person's behavior is not acceptable, then we have to put a boundary up to see if we can control or change that behavior. And if we can't, we have to decide, this is how I'm going to be treated. Do I stay or do I go? And actually, this might be a good transition, if you don't mind, for that tennis match that I was just referencing.
Absolutely.
Well, if you and I, Isaac, are playing tennis for a lot of years, we're partners, okay? And our relationship, it just doesn't feel like it's healthy. And then I go work with this Diana woman and I get all these new tools and things. And then I come back on the game, you're going to be like, what's happening, right? All of a sudden I'm hitting the ball in a different place. Because if we've been playing tennis for 20 years, you already have a pre-designed expectation. How I'm going to react when the ball goes over here, how I'm going to respond when it goes over there. We have this perfect game, even if it's abusive and terrible, we know exactly how to play it. And most people just keep playing that game that way. When you go and really do self-reflection and evaluate things at a new level and try and seek all those core beliefs that you got when you were a child that aren't working for you, you suddenly get a new perception. A new perception creates new behavior. So when you come out on the court, now you're playing a completely different game. So people say you can't control other people, and that is a true statement. But you can rest assured, if you're playing the game differently, something's happening on the other side of the court. And that person is going to be like, what just happened? What is going on here? And depending upon who that person is, that's what's going to tell you what happens next, right? The other person might realize, hey, this new game is a lot more loving than the game we were playing. how'd you learn to play this way? I'd like to do that too. Or they might be, okay, I'm not winning this game anymore because I can't control that person anymore. I don't like this game. And so they're going to escalate and play harder and meaner. Okay. So it's like the dynamic changes and you get a better image of who this other person is. And that's what determines where it's going to go from there. So to try and put it in a simple sequence, it's recognizing your own emotions, assessing, don't judge that emotion. Instead, evaluate the basis of it. Decide if it's your own wound. If it is, get self-reflected, go in and journal. If it's something that was cruel or said to you that is inappropriate, draw a boundary. And as you do this more and more, you get more and more disclosure. I always say, if you've never been vulnerable with your partner, you've never been hurting, needing support, feeling a bit broken, or you've hid that from your partner, you have no idea who your partner is, because you don't know who that other person is until you show the true vulnerability of yourself.
Absolutely. And one thing which is super prevalent in many of the relationships that I've had, and things you see all the time, is displacement. And very often people who are, let's say they have a bad day at work, or they had a bad experience, or they have a wound which hasn't been self-analyzed or really considered or talked about, and they displace it onto a partner, could be perceived as unfairly, um, essentially putting it on them when it is something which has nothing to do with that person. Now, in terms of relationships, how do you vision the dynamic in a relationship, in terms of, is the one person always supposed to be there for the other person, regardless of it, if it is quote unquote their issue or not? Or are there boundaries that need to be set up in circumstances like that?
Powerful question. Okay. No one should, what I call, tolerate the intolerable. Okay. So what that means is, if every day you have a bad day, you come, punch me in the face. Okay. This is tolerating the intolerable. Okay. So if it's not a simple question. Okay. It has to do with maturity and wholeness. I believe we are on a mission for wholeness. Okay. To come to our wholeness. One of the best books out there, I think, on this, and I think I'm sure I've mentioned this to you, and it's such a simply written book, is The Four Agreements, okay, and Mastery of Love, both by Don Miguel Ruiz. But in there, he talks about our wounds, and he talks about how our reactions are a byproduct of our wounds, and so on and so forth. So, of course, if I have a bad day, I really don't have the right to come and attack somebody else because I had a bad day. It's one thing to let out my anger, but not directing it at that person. And so there's a difference. If I'm directing it at that person and taking it out on them, that is not acceptable. That needs a boundary. But if I'm just like, oh, I had the worst day, and I'm, griping and maybe even yelling or whatever, but I'm talking about my experience, to me, that's a little different. Okay. Because that's me leaning on you. Okay. That's me saying what I'm experiencing. So in the Four Agreements, he says, don't take anything personal. That's one of the agreements. And that's kind of the key, is you have to be able to differentiate between what somebody is applying towards you intentionally, making it personal about you, versus, am I just taking it personal? So that's not, a simple question to answer, but it does address what you're saying. So our behavior is always our responsibility. Isaac, no matter how you treat me, how I react is about me. So it is never, well, that person made me do it. No. I mean, I'm not talking about a situation with self-defense, like literally where life or death circumstances, but we're always responsible for our own behavior. So if somebody is griping about you, when it's not about that, it's about some experience they're having, that's where, in my viewpoint, it needs a boundary. When somebody is just griping because they have an experience they want to share, I think, depending upon the manner in which they're sharing it, that's an opportunity to go deeper in the relationship, to bond more. This person showing their vulnerability, their pain, and then to support that is a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. And one thing that I kind of want to get into, which is a little bit similar to what you were just saying, in terms of relationships, a lot of the time, especially in terms of sex differences. Males and females have different ways of listening and communicating. So, one thing that I've experienced personally quite a bit is when someone is being vulnerable, talking about feelings, it's very easy and normal for me to want to come up with a solution,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And for a lot of people, they just want to be heard. And I would, once again, I'm not a health professional, but I would estimate that as largely more of a feminine trait,
Mm-hmm.
whereas coming up with solutions is more of a masculine trait, which
Mm-hmm.
leads to disconnect a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are aspects within that which I guess make it so that both people aren't feeling heard. And it's very tough to come at things from a completely different perspective in terms of, hey, I'm listening to you, but I am maybe not. I'm maybe trying to come up with a solution so it can be fixed, rather than just listening to you so that you can get your emotions out and I can be a rock for you. And you, as a therapist, I think it is very important. And one of our conversations was very telling in this sense. You are very good at listening without telling them exactly what they should do.
Yeah.
And in terms of relationships, how do you kind of separate the what we're used to in terms of communication styles to being there more for our partner on both a masculine and feminine side?
It is true, and I try to stay away from anything sexist. Also, like men are always like this, and women are always like
Right.
that. But there's a couple of things I tease about. There's a little video out there that talks about the nothing box in men, where they're not thinking about anything. Well, women don't have much of that nothing box. They've got the everything box. They're always got all these thoughts. And another example though is that men kind of move right into the solution, where women are more into the emotion. But I want to clarify that because it's not men and women; it's masculine and feminine, and we all have masculine and feminine traits. How balanced they are determines our wholeness. So in the work that people do with me, I do want to clarify, I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm a life coach, but yes, I do the same kind of work. But the concept is that the more balanced we can get our masculine and feminine, the better. And I had a very pivotal point in my life about this, and it really has helped me tremendously through the years. The more somebody respects your opinion, the more careful you should be with it. The reason I'm saying that is when someone comes to you vulnerable with their own emotions and they have a lot of regard for you, and you go right into solution mode, they often feel like they have to take your solution. And when your solution isn't something they really want to do or have the courage to do or whatever it may be, you sort of now become the enemy. I always say when somebody's being vulnerable and next they're yelling at you, you're probably doing it wrong. So, one of the things, obviously, as a coach, I do tell people what to do a lot, but I don't start there, as you pointed out. It's a lot of listening, understanding, gaining perspective, and so on. Okay. But ultimately, when you're listening to somebody, before giving an opinion, you could say, would you like my thoughts on that? Would you like my opinion on that? And you could even further it and say, oh, would you like me to just listen? So there's an expression, seek first to understand and then be understood. And that's just always a good idea. So going right into fix it mode, honestly, many of us, and I'm including myself in this because I am very balanced in my male and female energies, but my whole career and life was male dominated world. I had much more male energy than female. And I had to learn that softer approach to be like, would you like my opinion? Because it's real easy to just go, well, here's what you need to do. So I really believe we have to not discount another person by presuming they don't know what to do. I mean, how many times have you been upset or reactive about something knowing you're being reactive about it, knowing, there's probably a better way to handle this, knowing you should probably pause and, you know, take a breather. But sometimes we don't. So to bring to somebody's attention, like shine the flashlight on their behavior when they probably already know, maybe in some cases they're not handling this well, is not going to get you anywhere. In fact, one of the worst things somebody could do is tell somebody to calm down and then like I'm demonstrating like taking your hands up and like pushing them down to calm down. It's the best way to get punched in the face. I mean, it's like, that's like the worst thing you can do. So to hear someone, just to hear them first, is always the right thing to do. And I always say there's a power in the pause. So the pause is where you're not already formulating your response, you're just listening. And then you can pause and say, I have some thoughts about this. I can share them if you'd like. And then the person gives you permission. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't give you permission. You speak and you're still fighting because they didn't know what you were going to say yet. But I think it's a matter of honor, to honor the person where they are. And I think that will avoid the discounting. Like, what are you letting that upset you so much? Or if you think that's upsetting, let me tell you what my day was. Like, this isn't even a big deal. Like, that's never the right thing to say, because whatever our problems are, they feel like a big deal to us in that moment, even if we know we're overreacting or it's not that big of a deal. In this moment, I told you earlier, the right emotion is the one that shows up. Then it's what you're going to do with it that defines your maturity. And it's all about maturity and moving to wholeness.
Mm-hmm. And one thing which you see very often, there's very differing opinions on it, is the word sorry. I think a lot of the time we're told to only say sorry if you mean it, and not, and but it can be a very powerful word, and it can be a very egotistical and prideful word too. It takes a lot for people to say sorry if they know that they've done something wrong. In the case of perhaps toxic relationships, when do you need to stop yourself from saying sorry?
By the way, you really are very good at the questions you're asking. Really, they're impressive. I'm like, wow, I'm going to be thinking again. Okay. Somebody once said to me, "Stop saying you're sorry because you're not a sorry person." I think that was a great message. Although I still probably say sorry. I catch myself going, "I just did it again." Okay, but it becomes sort of an overutilized phrase, and so I tend to translate to the word "I apologize," because the word words "I apologize" takes ownership in what actually happened. Okay, what actually happened when I say I apologize, then there's potentially meaning behind it. Okay, so because we all assess things through our own filter, this is back to where are our wounds, right? So if I say, well, I apologize you took it that way, you know, like, here we go. you know, yet sometimes that's the case, right? Because your intention, but this person's wound is driving a different intention. So I don't think it's so much about the apology or the sorry or the I apologize as much as it is the underlying communication. So, what is it that hurt you about what I said? I always encourage people to use the word what instead of why. Because if you say, why are you upset about what I just said? It automatically triggers a defense on the other side. Because it's almost like why'd you do that? Like, what's wrong with you? So I believe that why often creates lies. Okay, when we have the word why, it creates like the person just gets defensive and now they're going to start lying. Not because they're liars, but because they feel kind of trapped. But if you say, what stirred up that anger, or what has you feeling this, it at least implies you're being open to a discussion. I think also for somebody to say, okay, I'm sorry, is meaningless if there was nothing achieved. Like, so, okay, I said I'm sorry, now what? So that's why I think the real core is what's under what happened. What's the core thing that caused that to happen, and trying to get to that. Now, there are times where we talked about earlier where you asked a question about, I had a bad day at work and, I flew off the handle or whatever. To me, those are times that you genuinely just go and apologize. Like, clearly, we make mistakes in life, and I think it's very important we own every aspect of every mistake. And in unhealthy relationships, they will never accept any blame at all. And if they do, watch what happens next, because they want something. So in genuine relationships, people recognize they're flawed humans. They make mistakes. They apologize for their behavior. They're genuinely sorry. Maybe sometimes they do suck it up and say, I'm sorry, or I apologize, or they didn't do anything. But the point that I'm making is it is genuinely about getting closer and understanding each other better. In a abusive dynamic, it will always come back. It'll never be on the person that is the abuser. It'll always be tied back to the other person. So they will become over responsible, apologizing all the time. That's why I say I'm sorry too much. I mean, it's a pattern from all those years of feeling like I had to apologize. And I will say to somebody sometimes on the first call, well, you don't have to tell me much about your partner. I already know. Because it's like, it's the patterns are so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's not so much the I'm sorry or I apologize as much as being willing to go deeper and understand what actually happened. And if one party is always blaming the other person, there is probably very little hope for the relationship.
Absolutely. And what you just touched on there in terms of going deeper into the actual root of the issue, there's a great book. I don't know if you've read it, Sue Johnson, Hold Me Tight. Uh, I read that a while ago, and it's not, of course, exclusive to her or this book, but very often a lot of people are in conflict over things which isn't the actual real conflict that needs to be resolved. Whether it's a little thing like you didn't put your coat away or you didn't do the dishes. Very seldomly is it actually about doing the dishes. It might be they don't feel respected or there are deeper issues. But what are some tips and tricks to kind of get to that point before just spending so much time on the little things, which might have been the trigger, but not the actual issue?
Yes, it is not the dishes in the sink. It's pretty much never the dishes in the sink. It's not that he doesn't put the toothpaste on. It's not. It's a bigger picture of not being seen, not being heard, not feeling respected. What you just said in a nutshell is correct. So thank you for clarifying, because when I say go deeper, I don't mean like what many times people will say to me, well, she doesn't clean this up or that up and this up or that up. And I'm like, well, so don't do it. Like, well, I have to do it. Why do you have to do it? Because it needs to be done. Well, you feel it needs to be done. Obviously, they don't feel it needs to be done. But what ends up happening is when you stop doing it, eventually it gets to the other person, then they start doing it. It's like so much of what is these things is really about control. It's something you want someone else to do. Damn it. Why won't you do it? And although you can influence another person, the more you try and control another person, guaranteed the more out of control things will get. Always and forever. The more you try and control it, the more it'll be out of control. The only person you really have control over is yourself. And so often what bothers us is what we feel other people should be doing. And I say, well, why don't you just observe? Because this is who you've got. This is what they are. You can voice your need. Like, I'd really appreciate it if you would not leave the dishes in the sink, because when I wake up in the morning, it makes me a little crazy. And I'd really appreciate it if you do it. Okay, so now you've made your need known, right? Okay, so next day, guess what? There's dishes in the sink. So what does that tell you? It tells you either the person's not listening, or they don't care, or they enjoy seeing you upset. I mean, there's a long list of things. But once you voice your need, if it's not a terrible inconvenience for somebody to do it, why wouldn't they do it? There's another underlying issue. So it is definitely about honor, respect, and also about control. So, and those are not good reasons. Those are all ego-driven reasons. Those are not the right reason. It should be about love and appreciation and honor. That is what should lead to changed behavior.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk about ego very quickly in terms of things and practices we can do to kind of deal with it in our own realm of
Yeah,
reality, but also within relationships?
yeah. Boy, ego sure does cause a lot of problems. When you talked about the sorry or apologize, ego gets in the way. When you talk about, I'll leave those damn dishes in the sink if I want to, ego gets in the way. Ego is comparable to sort of like the thing we think we have to listen to not lose control, or the thing we have to listen to stay on top of things. And it's actually not true at all. The ego is the power and control. I mentioned earlier the power and control wheel. If you look at all those things on there, it's the ego driving it, and the ego is because the person doesn't have their own security and maturity to use anything else. That's all they got is the ego. So the ego is kind of like, at its worst form, the biggest, baddest bully of all. Okay. And so you have to be pretty secure in yourself to not let your ego be the driver. I saw a video once where they said you have to gently put the ego in the back seat, because if you tell it get back there, it's going to get bigger and badder, because you can't. The ego needs to be tamed, if you will, but you can't tame it by violently, insisting it stop. And I, in my book, describe it as sort of ego versus spirit, the spirit being sort of the love side of things and the ego being the dominant side of things. And you need a little of both. Okay. You need a little of both, because, your ego is going to help you in certain situations that maybe aren't healthy, that you need to put some, if you just had your spirit of love and you didn't have what I call the sword, the ability to fight, then you're just going to get trampled on. So, it's a complex subject, and I kind of overlapped two different ideas there, so it might have been a little confusing. But at the
No,
end
no.
of the day, the ego is about power and control. I'm right, you're wrong. And it doesn't factor in compassion and love. It's just not even in the formula. And without compassion and love, things don't work. But if you only have compassion and love, you'll be trampled on, taken advantage of, because you need to also be able to see the rest of the story. I describe that as having a sword. When you have, and I'm not really directly comparing the ego to the sword, and that's why I'm kind of hesitant on how this is presenting itself. But what I'm saying is this: when you think that it's bad when you confuse protection and harm, you have a very difficult time being in healthy relationships. What I was doing was thinking it was wrong to do something that might lead for somebody getting hurt, instead of realizing all I was doing was protecting myself. So if I have a sword, if we had really bad childhood and we said, I'm never going to hurt anybody like these people hurt me, I'm never going to do that, we drop our sword, figuratively speaking. And then we go through life unprotected. And if we pick up the sword, then we start thinking, well, maybe I just have to attack everybody because I'm nervous, I'm scared, I don't know how to use this. In a perfect world, we learn to pick up the sword, keep it by our side, and know that we seldom need it. Because once we know we're armed and can protect ourselves, we don't need it anymore, because we are no longer driven by fear. We are driven by trust and knowing. If we ever need to know that, if we ever need to use that, we'll know. We'll know when to use it. We'll know when it's right. We release our fear and accept our wholeness and trust. So you can't be all about ego and be whole. It's impossible. There's no way to make that happen.
Yeah, and going off the idea of a sword,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this at all, but you've told me previously about something that you told your daughter, and that really impacted not only her life but also things and practices which other people may be able to relate to and could help them. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
I do. That's great. She got it in that moment. I got it, 100 years later. But so, as I mentioned, I had a pattern of choosing poor relationships, abusive relationships, diminishing, controlling, and there was various severity. I mean, and I'll just be a little extreme. It's not really extreme; it's the truth. But I'll bring some of those to light just to kind of get the listener to listen to this, and they might say, "Oh, well, that's never happened to me." And before you accept that, I want you to realize most of the harm that comes from these relationships happen when you're willing to leave. Okay, before you are willing to leave and you're just the perfect marionette doing everything they need to feel better, the real violence doesn't come out. But the reason why you were behaving unconsciously is because you knew the violence was there. Like, so somewhere when you knew they were punching holes through walls and breaking things and damaging your property, you're thinking, maybe they can do that to me. So you unknowingly kind of get on a track of behaving so that doesn't happen to you. And so then you have the illusion, yeah, well, he's never really hit me, or she's never really hit me, or she's never really threatened me. But as soon as you try and move into your independent things will escalate, because now they're losing control. When they're losing control, they're going to escalate. So very early in my life, when my child was very young, I was in an abusive situation. I was engaged to this person. And I finally realized I had to break it off. And of course, as soon as I realized I had to break it off, it got violent. Okay, I'm going to write something down because there's two stories that come to mind. Okay, and they're both very relevant. I think it's a nice way to really encapsulate this. So in this relationship, once I broke it off, came back to the house. He tried to physically assault me. To be totally frank, he tried to rape me. Okay, um, but I was seeing a therapist at the time, and um, I was breaking off the relationship, and she asked me what I told my daughter. What did you tell your daughter about why you were breaking off the relationship? And I said, I told her I was breaking off the relationship because he was a very good man. He was a very good man who did some very bad things, and he wasn't safe for us to live with anymore. I was feeling pretty good about that. Her look, she just had this shock look on her face, and she said, "Do you think what he has done to you is acceptable?" And you brought this up earlier, Isaac. The things that he's done to you, would you ever do to another person? And I said, "No, I would never." She said, "Well, why would you never do it?" I said, "Well, my gosh, it's cruel, it's abusive, it's controlling, it's harmful." She goes, "Then why would you say he's a good man? He's You need to go home. You need to leave this session right now. You need to go get your daughter." And I'm doing a rough guess right now, but I would say she was like 4 years old. Okay. You need to go get your daughter. You need to tell her you made a terrible mistake. You made a terrible mistake. And the mistake you made was that you told her he was a good man that did some bad things. And the truth is, he's a bad man that did some good things. I can feel the emotion even now.
Mhm.
That moment, I saw a side of my young daughter that I had never seen. I mean, when she heard that, she was just devastated, okay, devastated because that I would call him a bad man. It was incomprehensible to her. And it was something we never talked about a lot after that, but it was just underlying there. Okay, it was underlying there. Okay, so fast forward now, I've written my book, which by the way it only took me a year to physically write it, but I've been working on it for 20 years because I had to realize that the premise of the book needed to not be about healing the heart of the abuser, but instead learning when you are being abused and how to end that abuse by improving your own sense of self and self-worth. So my daughter hadn't read my book, but I asked her if she'd be like an editor on it and look it over or whatever. And we are now out to having coffee. She agreed that she would do it. Again, hasn't seen the book. And we're there with her newly born son. And she looks at me and she says, Mom, it's the weirdest thing, but you know what flashed through my mind? And she brought up that story that I just told you about. She said, that was the time when I realized that there are bad men in the world. And I think that's why I've never had an abusive relationship. She's had relationships come and go like the rest of us, but she's never been in an abusive relationship where there was physical harm, where there was degrading, but ever. And she credits it to that moment. But remember, in that moment, she was, as I said, about 4 years old. That was in the 80s. Okay. I didn't wake up till 2007, folks. Not for nothing. And so the second story I was going to say, and maybe this is something that no one can relate to, and just they'll say, "Oh, well, nothing's like that. It's been that bad to me." But along those same lines, it was many years later, just before I woke up, probably that same year that I did wake up. I had been reading the book, The Gift of Fear, which I often recommend. And in the book, there is a chapter called Intimate Enemies. I wasn't going here, but here I am. So here we go. There's a chapter called Intimate Enemies, and there's 30 points that if you look at those 30 points, you can look at it and it will predict violent behavior. Like, what are the odds that you're in a relationship that can turn violent? So, I'm sorry, this isn't funny. What's funny is what I'm about to say.
Right, right.
That wasn't funny. So I'm reading this book, not realizing it's beginning to wake me up. I'm not even realizing it. And I'm going down the list of these 30 things, and I'm putting an initial of the person I'm with at the time as a classification of he used all of these traits. The only ones that weren't true is number 1 and number 30, which was that the woman is afraid she'll be harmed. Because I wasn't conscious of my fear. I was afraid, just didn't acknowledge it. And so all these lists of bad behaviors are on there. And I'm then going down the list and showing all the ones that have changed. And I'm actually saying, boy, Diana, look how well you're helping. Like all these bad traits that are on a list of predicting violent behavior are going away. Well, what I have since learned, they weren't going away, they were being hidden because these relationships are doing what they can to not get a game over card. They don't want a game over card. So, and if there is a game over card, they want it to be on their terms. So if they see a game over card coming, they'll start to alter their behavior just to keep the game on their terms. And so there was a time that I had come home and we picked up the mail, and there was a letter that was very disturbing to the man, and he tried to strangle me. He saw red. He was a crazy person. That wasn't the only time, by the way. So he tried to strangle me, and he's holding on, tightly. And I literally smack him in the face, and he lets go. And I normally didn't detail these kinds of events out to anyone because remember, you protect the man. But I felt so sorry for him. This is back, when I was asleep. I felt so sorry for him that had happened to him, that I excused away that horrible response pattern as, he just reacted, what didn't mean anything. I tell my daughter this story, and she says, Mom, the fact that you can use the name of the person you're in a relationship with and tried to kill me in the same sentence and don't see there's a problem is the problem. And there you have it. It's like being that asleep. You excuse away behavior at a small scale that keeps increasing. And that was, I believe, the year that I finally woke up completely and realized what a dangerous situation I was actually in. And that's when my business, which I already had, I was already a life coach, changed and gotten a lot more relational. And even though I still do a lot of the business executive and that type of training, it is far more deep about the power of our perceptions, about our inability to look beyond these embedded beliefs until we actually step back and examine them. So how was that?
Yeah.
A little more than you asked for.
No, that's perfect because I think the best thing about that is these are incredibly challenging life experiences, which me, especially being a man, I can't even imagine them happening to me. But to put a positive spin on them and not only make it out of the suffering, but also want to help other people
Yes.
wake up from that reality is one of the most powerful things that we can do. And using our suffering and our pain and things that we've gone through and examine them and realize where they may come from and why we put up with them can only help support other people and make other people feel more loved, cared about, and also surround yourself with the right kind of people and open yourself up to realizing, hey, this person is not a good person. I shouldn't be excusing away the things that they do, the evil aspects of that person, and recognizing that we deserve other people who are ready for love and accepting of our faults and but also supporting our growth. So I want you to kind of I know that you're short on time. I'd love you to just quickly talk about some last kind of words of wisdom, advice that you'd have for people who are struggling with not even just relationships, but just in terms of life.
Yes, and some of the things you brought up, I want to emphasize. One is, as much as all that stuff was horrible, I have like no regrets, no remorse, because it woke me up to what's happening to so many people that is hidden. They never tell anybody. It's happening behind closed doors. Nobody knows. And they can, to the outer world, appear so successful in a very dynamic, relationship. It looks so good, and it isn't. And the thing is that once we wake up, we have a lot of shame, like, we feel shameful. And so, to your point, your stories, whatever your stories are, anybody listening, um, one is you shouldn't have shame about them because everything happened perfectly. It happened that way to advance you at some level to some other powerful purpose and need in your life that maybe you don't even know what it is yet. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have predicted that this is where, I wouldn't have predicted this. But, here I am. I mean, I love what I do. And being a life coach is very fulfilling. But if I had never had those experiences, these stories would be completely unrelatable. Even somebody who has the textbook knowledge would not be able to relate. People think, how could that ever happen? How could that ever be? So I think that some of the things that we experience that maybe we feel shame about are instead something we should almost just recognize, not wear it like, to me, I hardly talk about that side of it anymore, truthfully. It's sort of like, oh, that was so long ago. But it's still what helped form me. So I think looking at what we've been through and not having any shame about it, being open to talking about it and realizing that that's what made us who we are, I think that's important. I also think it's important that people know no matter what it is, it's not our job to protect people from their bad behavior, to make excuses for bad behavior, that everybody needs to be accountable. And if somebody's being abusive, I mean, we all have our moments, but you need to have an understanding that you will not continuously tolerate the intolerable. And in order to do that in any part of your life, whether it's business or relationships or friendships, and you have to be able to measure where that intolerance is. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, Don Miguel Ruiz says this. He says, I might not be quoting it exactly, but something like, we will tolerate from another the level of abuse we give ourselves. So this is why, at the end of the day, it always comes back to how we take care of ourselves. What, our tolerance is about what we're willing to use our stamina and endurance to 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 endure. And that's what's wrong with the picture. We don't have to endure anything. We can let go of people. It's okay. You don't have to tolerate it. When people says there's no way, I say they can never get out of a relationship or end the friendship or leave the job, the first thing is, well, that's a mistake, and that's a mistake. That's actually not true. There is always a way out, and your life is your responsibility. The quality of life is your responsibility, and it takes courage to live a life on your terms. And this is about learning to honor yourself and the relationships that you have, and not having anything less than relationships that are honorable. They can have slight upsets, we all have them, but there has to be, at the end of the day, communication and honor. And to get to that place where you can have an internal locus of control, be objective about all your external circumstances, but knowing where to engage and where not to keep yourself fulfilled.
Yeah, and branching off that a little bit, I just want people to know, one, I'm going to put in the notes for this podcast where they can reach you if they would like to get some help from you. Also, one of the reasons why I really want to start this podcast is because obviously I'm still pretty young. I haven't had much life experience, but one thing that I've found is I've been through depression. I've been through toxic relationships where it was toxic towards me, and I was also a toxic partner. And I think the main thing that we all should strive to do is be open about vulnerabilities with each other, and create support systems and try and understand people who may be going through these incredibly tough situations where even if you don't necessarily understand what they're going through, be there for them to try and support them, because that can be sometimes one of the most meaningful things in their life and could absolutely change their life, as a testament to me as well. So did you have any last words that you kind of want to just end on?
Well, that was beautifully spoken, what you just said. And I think the first thing is, as elementary as it is, the waking up part is the hardest part, because when we look at that, we realize a lot's going to have to change. Like, what if this is all going to have to change? But the reward that comes on the other side is so magnificent and freeing. It's always worth it. But if we're not willing to self evaluate, as you just said, we're not willing to look at ourselves, and openly hear other people, we'll never get there. It's just, you have to have a broad-based mind.
I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, and I'm going to have you on again in the future.
Well, that'd be great, Isaac. Thank you.